Welcome back to the Deep Dive. It's Wednesday, February 26th, 2025. And, well, the news today is, it's pretty wild, honestly. There are a lot of stories that are just kind of, making us scratch our heads. So we're going to dive into three big ones from the Videntis today and hopefully make some sense of it all.
Sounds good. I'm ready.
Okay, so first up, we've got House Republicans, and they are facing, let's just say it, a lot of heat from voters over these recent budget cuts and layoffs. I mean, people are not happy. And then on the other hand, you've got President Trump rolling out this new plan to attract wealthy investors with a gold card visa program. Yeah, you heard that right. $5 million gets you residency. It's like something out of a movie. And then to top it all off, we're seeing that rising healthcare costs are causing a lot of anxiety among Trump voters, which seems kind of ironic considering affordable healthcare was a big part of his campaign platform. So yeah, layoffs while recording the wealthy, budget cuts, A&D, healthcare concern. Well, a lot to unpack. What do you think?
It certainly is. It's like a political puzzle.
Totally. So let's start with this budget backlash. I mean, the news is reporting that House Republicans are straight up avoiding town halls because people are so angry, protests, shouting matches, the whole 9 yards. Why do you think these budget cuts are hitting such a nerve?
You know, it's interesting. It reminds me a lot of what happened during the healthcare debates. Back in 2009 and 2017, there was a similar kind of public outcry, and I think it speaks to a deeper level of frustration with the direction things are going with the current administration.
And then you add Elon Musk into the mix, and it's like throwing gasoline on the fire.
Yeah.
He's the one heading up the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE as they're calling it. And he's been pushing hard for these cuts.
Yeah.
But it's the House Republicans who are taking all the heat.
Right. It puts them in a really tough spot. They're kind of caught between their constituents who are feeling the pain of these cuts and the White House, which is, well, let's just say they seem to be very much on board with Musk's vision.
Yeah. Some Republicans are even saying that Musk has more influence in the White House than they do.
Yeah.
There's this one quote that's been making the rounds that says, Musk is more liked by people in the White House than anyone here because we have to deal with the ramifications of what he says. That's pretty telling, don't you think?
It definitely highlights the power dynamics at play here.
Yeah.
And it really underscores the challenge of trying to balance fiscal responsibility with the needs and concerns of everyday people. It's not an easy task. And you're right, some Republicans are actually starting to push back. They're calling for the White House to rehire people they believe were wrongly let go. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Okay, well, let's move on to something a little more, shall we say, sparkly. Trump's gold card visa programming. Come on. You can't make this stuff up. $5 million and you get a U.S. residency just like that.
Right.
It's replacing the old EB-5 investor visa program. But this new version is it's definitely raising some eyebrows.
It's certainly a bold move. The program is essentially designed to attract wealthy investors who are willing to make a substantial investment, $5 million to be precise, in exchange for permanent U.S. residency.
$5 million. I mean, that's a drop in the bucket for some people, but for most of us, that's like winning the lottery. So who exactly is Trump hoping to attract with this, and what's the bigger picture here?
Well, the stated goal is to stimulate the economy by bringing in this influx of wealth and potentially to help reduce the national deficit. It's a strategy that's been tried before with mixed results. But what's really interesting is whether Trump can even legally implement this program without congressional approval. That's a whole other can of worms.
So there's a chance this whole gold card idea could blow up in his face. Do you think Congress will try to block it?
It's definitely possible. This whole situation raises some thorny questions about immigration policy under whether wealth should be the primary factor in determining who gets to live in the U.S. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Okay, well, let's round out our deep dive today with a topic that's near and dear to all of our hearts, healthcare. This one's particularly interesting because it seems like Trump voters are increasingly worried about the rising cost of healthcare, which seems to contradict the promises that got him elected.
Yeah, it's a significant shift in sentiment from just a few years ago. Back then, it wasn't as prominent of an issue, but now it's become a top concern for many Trump voters.
And for good reason. The news is reporting that as many as 22 million Americans could lose their healthcare coverage if these proposed budget cuts go through. That's a scary thought.
It is. And we're not just talking about people losing coverage. The potential impacts of these cuts are much broader. We could see millions of people facing higher insurance premiums cuts to Medicaid and ultimately less access to affordable care. It's a recipe for disaster.
And it all ties back to those budget cuts we were talking about earlier. It's like a vicious cycle.
Exactly. There's a real tension here between Trump's policies and the needs of his constituents. And healthcare is a prime example of that. This is going to be a major battleground in the months to come.
Well, it sounds like we've got budget cuts, gold card visas, and healthcare concerns all swirling around in the news today. It's a lot to digest, but I feel like we're starting to connect some dots here. What's really striking me is how these seemingly separate stories are all intertwined in some way.
You've hit the nail on the head, and it raises an important question that I think we should explore further. Who ultimately benefits and who bears the cost of these decisions?
That's a great point. It makes you really think about the winners and losers in all of this.
It's precisely, and that's something we're going to delve into more deeply in just a moment.
I'm all for it. But first, let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsors. We'll be right back.
It really is fascinating when you think about it. This whole idea of winners and losers when it comes to political decisions. It's something we don't always talk about, but it's like, the underlying current in so much of what's happening.
I know. It's so true. It's easy to get caught up in the headlines and all the drama, but when you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, you start to see these patterns emerge.
Yeah.
Like, okay, who's actually benefiting from this? And who's getting the short end of the stick? So how do we even begin to unpack something as complex as this thing? Where do we even start?
Well, let's take those budget cuts as an example. On the surface, the goal is usually to reduce government spending and increase efficiency.
Yeah, which sounds great in theory. I mean, who doesn't want a more efficient government?
Right, exactly. Less waste, more bang for your buck. But the reality is that those cuts often have a ripple effect. Real people lose their jobs, programs get scaled back, and sometimes certain groups end up bearing a larger share of the burden than others.
So who are the winners in that scenario?
Well, potentially taxpayers could see some benefit down the road, maybe in the form of lower taxes. And there's also an argument to be made that a leaner government can be more responsive, less bureaucratic, more adaptable to change.
But on the other side of that coin, you have people whose lives are directly affected by these cuts. Jobs, lost, disruptions to services. It's not just numbers on a spreadsheet. We're talking about people's lives.
Absolutely. And that's where things get really complicated. It's not always a simple equation. We have to consider the human cost, the social impact of these decisions.
Okay, so we've talked about budget cuts. Let's shift gears to Trump's gold card visa program. Who stands to gain from that one? Is it as straightforward as it seems?
Well, on the surface, it would seem like the biggest winners are those wealthy investors, the ones who can afford that $5 million price tag. They get permanent residency in the U.S., all the benefits that come with that.
And I'm assuming the government is hoping to see some major benefits too, right?
Yeah.
Millions of dollars flowing into the economy. This is going to be a win for them.
That's the idea, at least. The hope is to stimulate economic growth, attract investment, create jobs, ultimately reduce the deficit. But there are potential downsides, too. It's not as simple as it might appear. Well, for one thing, critics of the program argue that it basically creates a two-tiered immigration system, where wealth is the deciding factor. And that raises some questions about fairness and equity. Are we saying that money is the only thing that matters?
It does seem like a program that could widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots.
That's a valid concern. And it ties into this larger conversation about wealth and privilege in our society. Who has access to opportunity? Who gets a leg up? Who gets left behind? These are questions we should be asking ourselves constantly.
Absolutely. All right, so we've covered budget cuts and gold cards. Let's bring it back to healthcare. This one feels especially relevant right now with so many people struggling to afford the basics.
You're right. Healthcare is such a fundamental need, and the rising costs are causing a lot of anxiety and uncertainty.
And it seems like Trump voters in particular are feeling disillusioned, like the promises of affordable healthcare haven't materialized.
That's definitely what we're seeing in the data. Despite the campaign promises, we're now seeing proposals for deep cuts. To programs like Medicaid, millions of people could lose access to essential care.
And on top of that, you've got the enhanced ACA subsidies set to expire soon, which means even higher premiums for a lot of folks.
It's a perfect storm, and it could have a devastating impact on people's health and well-being.
So who wins in this scenario?
Well, there are a lot of powerful interests at play in the healthcare industry. Insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, they all have a stake in how things play out. And certain policy decisions can benefit some players while hurting others.
But at what cost? It feels like a zero-sum game sometimes.
That's a crucial question to ask. When profit becomes the driving force in healthcare, when people become commodities, that's when we need to step back and re-examine our values as a society.
It's a sobering thought for sure.
It is. I don't want to be all doom and gloom, but I think it's important to be realistic about the challenges we face. The good news is that by having these conversations, by shining a light on these complexities, we can start to hold our leaders accountable. and push for a more equitable system.
I agree. We can't just sit back and accept these outcomes. We have to question the systems and structures
Yeah.
that perpetuate these inequality.
Exactly. We need to be asking ourselves, who benefits from these policies? Who pays the price? Are these outcomes aligned with our values as a society? These are the questions that should be driving our civic engagement.
Okay, so we've talked about budget cuts, immigration, and healthcare. And it seems like this pattern of winners and losers plays out in so many other areas of our lives, too. It's almost like a universal law or something.
You're absolutely right. It's a recurring theme in everything from environmental policy to education to criminal justice. Understanding this dynamic is crucial for becoming informed and engaged citizens. It's about connecting the dots, seeing the bigger picture, recognizing the forces at play.
It's a lot to process, but I feel like I'm starting to see things from a new perspective, a more critical lens.
That's the power of critical thinking. It allows us to challenge assumptions, question the status quo, imagine alternative possibilities. And that's what we need more of in our world today.
I'm ready to keep exploring those possibilities. But for now, let's shift gears a bit and dive into some real-world examples of how these power dynamics play out in specific situations. So we've been talking about this whole winners and losers thing and how it seems to be everywhere you look. I'm ready for some real-world examples. What are some situations where this dynamic is really obvious?
Well, one that's hard to ignore these days is climate change. I mean, the science is clear. Human activity is causing the planet to warm up, and we're already seeing the effects.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to miss all the extreme weather and rising sea levels and everything.
Right, and to really tackle climate change, we need to move away from fossil fuels. I mean, they're the main culprit behind all these emissions.
But that's where things get sticky, right? Because you're talking about going up against these giant, powerful industries that have a lot to lose.
Exactly. The fossil fuel industry has a huge stake in keeping things the way they are, even if it means the planet suffers in the long run.
So it's like they're the winners and the rest of us are left holding the bag.
It's not quite that simple.
Yeah.
But you're right, there's a real imbalance of power there. And it's not just about the environment either. It's about the social and economic impacts too. You know, communities that depend on fossil fuels for jobs could really struggle as we transition to cleaner energy.
It's a tough situation with no easy answers. But I guess the first step is recognizing who benefits and who loses from different choices.
Absolutely. Let's look at another example. Education. In the U.S., our education system is often criticized for reinforcing inequality instead of fixing it.
Yeah, you see it all the time. The huge gap between schools in wealthy areas and schools in poorer areas. It's a problem.
It is. And it often breaks down along racial and economic lines. Kids from disadvantaged backgrounds often don't have the same opportunities as wealthier kids.
So the winners are the kids who get to go to fancy schools, and the losers are the ones who don't.
You could put it that way. And it's not just about grades and diplomas, it's about their whole future. A good education opens doors. It gives you choices. But when we don't invest in all students equally, we're basically holding back our whole society.
It's a cycle that's really hard to break.
Yeah.
But I think, like you said before, it starts with recognizing the problem and questioning how things are done.
I agree. Okay, one last example that really shows these power dynamics. The criminal justice system. The U.S. has more people in prison than any other country, and there's no denying that race plays a role in how the system works.
It does seem like the system is biased against certain groups, especially people of color.
And it's important to remember that some people actually benefit from mass incarceration. For example, private prisons make money when more people are locked up. And then there are companies that use prison labor.
So they're the winners, and the people who get caught up in the system are the losers.
That's one way to look at it. And the consequences are huge. Prison can ruin lives. It can tear families apart. And it makes poverty and social problems worse.
Wow. These examples are really eye-opening. It's like there's this pattern of power and privilege and unequal access to resources that just keeps repeating itself.
You're getting it. And recognizing that pattern is so important. If you want to be an informed citizen, you need to be aware of these forces at work. You need to see the bigger picture.
It's a lot to think about, but I feel like I'm seeing the world in a whole new way.
That's what we're hoping for. Knowledge is power. The more we understand about these issues, the better we can fight for a fairer world.
Well said. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up our deep dive for today. It's been a fascinating conversation.
I agree. It's always a pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. We hope this has given you some food for thought. We encourage you to keep asking questions, keep learning, keep pushing for a better future. Until next time, keep diving deep.